Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're heading back out to the Appalachian Mountains to dive into two of the wildest stories I've come across lately. Full of creepy legends, strange disappearances, and weird lights in the woods. It's a place that practically breathes mystery and fear. And these two stories, they fit that reputation perfectly. The first one happened over 30 years ago, but it hits like it happened yesterday, and nothing about it has changed since. The second is just plain bizarre and seriously disturbing. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. It's been over 34 years since that trip. And to this day, sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'm being chased all over again. It doesn't happen as often as it did when I was younger. Over the years, I've learned to cope better. But I think the fact that I was so young when it all happened left a deeper mark. It was the summer of 1991. I was just 13 years old back then. And if I'm being honest, that summer was supposed to be the last one we'd all spend together. My dad, my mom, my older sister Rachel, and me. My sister was planning to move to Europe, and even though neither mom nor dad wanted to admit it, we all knew she was probably going to stay there. So this was our last chance to be together as a family, at least for a couple of years. I remember how excited we were about heading down to the Appalachian Trail for a week of camping and hiking. Even my mom, who was never much of a fan of mountain trips, was excited. My dad had planned everything for months. He said we'd disconnect from the world, just be a family in nature, no distractions. We left early on a Saturday morning, everything packed tight in Dad's old Ford Explorer. The kind that always smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and his cologne. A smell that never quite went away. I remember the feeling of the mountain air hitting my face as we drove deeper into the Appalachians. The trees getting thicker, the road narrower. I remember thinking that the scenery was as beautiful as it was completely terrifying. The first couple of days went just as Dad had hoped. We hiked long trails, set up camp near a creek, told stories by the fire while eating burnt marshmallows, and listened to the sounds of the forest at night. The biggest miracle of all was that my sister and my dad actually went 3 whole days without fighting. So everything was going even better than any of us had expected. I was always a little jumpy in the dark, especially when my sister purposely told scary stories just to freak me out. But Dad would always laugh it off, saying, "Critters out here are more afraid of you than you are of them, most of the time anyway." It was the 4th day when things started to feel a little off. We'd hiked farther than we had the previous days. I remember my mom being a bit worried that it might be too much for me, but I was eager to prove I could handle it. So even though I was tired, I kept pretending I was excited to keep going. We passed an old, rusted-out pickup truck just off to the side in the woods, far from the trail, half covered in brush and vines. It looked like it had been sitting there for years, but the door had clearly been opened recently. The ground around it was clear. My dad stopped and stared at it for a moment, like something about it didn't sit right. We all walked closer to the truck, and I saw Mom and Dad exchange a look. Then my sister said that someone had definitely been sleeping inside. You could see a bunch of personal stuff in the cab, and even though it was dirty, it all looked kind of recent. As my dad inspected it more closely, I caught sight of what looked like someone watching us from the bushes. I was just about to say something when my sister looked at me and said, I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. I really didn't want to seem like a scared kid. They'd probably think I was making it up, so I kept that to myself. Dad eventually said not to worry. It was probably someone's old hunting truck from years ago. Then he walked away from the truck, and we moved on. That night, we made camp in a clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It took hours to find that spot and set up our tent. We'd walked a long way from where we saw that pickup, and at some point, I'd overheard my mom telling my dad she wanted to set up camp as far away from that truck as possible, just to be safe. Then we did exactly what we'd done the nights before. Started a small fire, cooked some food, and sat around talking. I thought again about telling them what I'd seen near the truck, but once again, I kept it to myself. Somewhere around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of crunching leaves. My first thought was that it might be a bear or something like that. But then I realized they were footsteps. Human footsteps. Not like an animal rustling, but heavy, deliberate steps. I thought maybe it was one of my parents. But their tent made a loud noise when you opened it, and I definitely would have heard that. I was stone still, like my body just shut off. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and steady, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I remember peeking out through the flap of the tent, and in the dim moonlight, I could just barely make out a figure standing beyond the tree line. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I covered my mouth with both hands to keep from screaming and grabbed my sister's leg. She let out a small sound in surprise. Whoever was out there must have heard it, because when I looked back, the figure was gone. I told my sister what I'd seen, that someone was out there, and that I had already seen someone watching us earlier by the pickup truck. She believed me instantly. I don't know if it was the panic on my face or the sound of my voice. But something made her realize I was serious. She signaled me to stay quiet and not leave the tent, then ran to wake up our parents. She told Dad someone was out there. He grabbed his flashlight and did a sweep, even called out, but nothing. No footprints, no sounds, no sign of anyone. He told me it was probably just a deer, or maybe I'd had a nightmare. But neither my sister nor I slept the rest of that night. I knew what I'd seen, and my sister had always had this freaky sixth sense. She knew something wasn't right. The next morning, we found the strings holding our food bags had been cut. Not chewed. Cut clean, like with a knife or something sharp. Some of our packs had been moved too. Nothing stolen, just messed with and rearranged. That was the first time I saw my dad genuinely worried. He didn't say it out loud, but it was all over his face. He asked me exactly what I had seen, where I had seen it. When I told him about the man near the truck, he looked truly concerned. My mom put a hand over her mouth and my sister said we should leave. We didn't know what that person wanted, and maybe they weren't dangerous, but it wasn't worth the risk. We packed up quickly and started hiking back toward where we had parked the car, even though we were supposed to stay 2 more nights. The weird thing was, we couldn't seem to find the same trail back. We followed the same markers. Dad was sure of it. But nothing looked familiar. The forest felt different. We were all clearly shaken, and stress can mess with your sense of direction. But then my sister saw something that scared the hell out of us. One of the trail markers looked faint, like someone had scraped it recently. A little farther along, we touched another sign, and Mom confirmed what she feared. Someone had tampered with the trail markers. They had erased one and painted another to lead us in a totally different direction. That night, we didn't even set up camp properly. We just threw down sleeping bags and kept the fire burning. Dad stayed up, holding the hatchet in one hand and his flashlight in the other. Around midnight, we heard it again. Footsteps circling us in the dark. And then laughter. Dad jumped up immediately, gun in hand, and fired into the air. But the laughter didn't stop. Whoever was out there in the darkness wasn't scared. I felt something wet on my hand and realized I was crying from sheer fear. My sister, who had her hands over her ears, pulled me close. My mom stood up too and grabbed the other gun, positioning herself on the opposite side of Dad, both of them forming a kind of shield around us. By this point, the laughter had stopped and silence took over. Complete, heavy silence. At first light the next morning we ran. We didn't even eat. We just picked a direction and started moving. We stopped following trail signs and just walked in the direction the compass pointed, not even sure we were heading the right way. We just wanted to get the hell out of that nightmare. But not even 3 minutes later, we stumbled onto something straight out of a horror movie. A completely destroyed campsite, dried blood everywhere, or at least what looked like blood. My mom immediately covered my eyes, but I had already seen. On the ground was a stuffed koala, torn to shreds. Outside one of the tents, a bloodied rock tied to a rope. No one said it, but we all knew. That rock had been used as a weapon and left there on purpose. But there was no one around. My dad stood there, stunned, not knowing what to say. And then we heard it again. The laughter. This time, farther away, but still too close. Whoever was out there had seen us, and they knew we were at that ruined campsite. My dad kept spinning around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but it felt like it was coming from every direction. It was my mom who finally snapped us out of it. She grabbed all of us and made us keep moving. Hours later, we stumbled onto an old ranger station, boarded up and abandoned. But inside, carved into a wooden wall, was a map that helped Dad figure out roughly where we were. There was a radio too, but the line had been cut. Still no cell signal. We had no idea exactly where we were, but at least we had shelter. This time, my mom took the first watch, but we didn't even get a chance to fall asleep before we heard it again. Laughter, just outside the shelter. My dad was losing it, seriously thinking about going out there and firing in every direction, but my mom stopped him. She told him we'd survive by staying together and trying to get out at first light. All through the night we heard the laughter, off and on, sometimes followed by a scraping sound against the wood. We didn't know what it was, but we found out in the morning. The entire outer wall of the shelter had been scratched up. Some areas had strange, unrecognizable symbols carved into them, clearly scratched in, probably with a knife. That day, we just kept running, sunburnt, dehydrated, and scared out of our minds. Eventually, we made it to a small village where we got a ride to the nearest police station. My dad reported everything to the local authorities, but they didn't take it seriously. It was over 25 years ago. The resources were more limited, and no one really seemed to care. They said maybe we ran into a hunter or a squatter, but there were no cabins in that area, No signs of anyone living nearby. My dad got so angry they almost arrested him. My mom had to calm him down and said the best thing we could do was get out of there. A few months later, my sister moved to Europe. My dad became obsessed with police reports and spent years combing through newspapers and other sources, looking for a missing family in that region. But the problem was, we didn't even know exactly where we had been. The forest was massive, and we had covered an equally massive area. My mom tried to block it all out. She banned my dad from talking about it around her. In a way, I followed in her footsteps. I watched my dad slowly get consumed by the mystery, but only as a bystander. I never acted on it, until now. It's been 2 years since it happened, and still, there are moments, small, unexpected ones, that bring it all rushing back like it just happened yesterday. Not in dramatic flashes, but in subtle, unsettling ways. Like when I catch the scent of damp soil mixed with wood smoke drifting in from someone's backyard fire pit. Or when the wind rustles through the trees late at night, just outside my bedroom window, in that same slow, dragging way it did back in those hills. That's when I feel it. The weight in my chest, the tension in my shoulders. Like my body recognizes something my brain keeps trying to forget. It was the summer of 2023. I had just turned 27, and my best friend Nate was finishing up a long, brutal breakup. We were both looking for a way to disconnect from everything. No phones, no news, no drama. Just a week off the grid, hiking and camping in the wild. So when Nate suggested we take a summer trip down to West Virginia, I was all in. We'd done smaller hikes before, weekend stuff mostly, but nothing like this. We spent a few weeks prepping, checking gear, mapping out a route that would take us about 5 days in and out, with stops at various backcountry sites. Nate borrowed a satellite phone from his brother just in case. We left on a Tuesday morning, late June. The heat was already pushing up past 90 by the time we got to the trailhead. I remember how the humidity hit like a wall as soon as we stepped out of the truck, and how the trees swallowed the sound of the road behind us the deeper we went. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it's an absolutely perfect feeling. As you move deeper into the trees and they begin to absorb the sounds of cars and the city, it's like everything you're leaving behind slowly starts to dissolve. It makes you feel more present, more aware of the moment you're in. The first day went smoothly. We hiked around 10 miles, found a nice spot beside a small river, and set up camp. We ate those vacuum-sealed camping meals that taste like warm cardboard, shared a couple of beers we'd kept cold in the truck's cooler, and sat under the stars, talking about life. It was good, and we were laughing. The next morning, we broke camp early and kept moving. The forest in that part of West Virginia is dense. Real old-growth trees, moss climbing up the trunks, light barely filtering through the canopy. Around midday, we passed a couple of other hikers going the opposite direction. An older guy and his daughter, I think. We exchanged some small talk and they warned us about bears, told us they'd seen fresh scat just a few miles up. Nate joked that he hoped the bears were vegan. I laughed, but I remember the dad didn't. He just gave us a strange look and said, "Be careful out there. There's a lot more than bears in these woods." Then they kept walking. At the time, I brushed it off as backwoods eccentricity. You know, locals trying to spook outsiders. But now, I'm not so sure. He was clearly trying to warn us, but something was stopping him from being completely direct. That evening, after another long day of hiking, we found a spot to set up camp again. It was a clearing near a ridge, good visibility, decent cover from wind. As we were setting up the tent, Nate found something odd just a little ways off. A pile of rocks, maybe 2 feet high, and sticking out of the middle of it was a deer skull. Just sitting there, clean, bleached by sun and time. There were no other bones, just the skull. He joked it was probably some kind of Appalachian Blair Witch thing, but I could tell it unsettled him too. We moved a little farther down before settling in. We're from a part of the country where cults aren't exactly rare, and a few years ago, his sister ended up caught in the middle of one. Things almost went really bad, but she got out just in time. So I know he said it like a joke, like he was just messing around, but I could tell. His body was tense, his eyes more focused. Deep down, he wasn't laughing. He was clearly tense. So I suggested we go for a short walk. Nothing major. We weren't going to stray far from where we were camped. Just move around a bit to clear our heads. He agreed, and we headed in the direction we'd be hiking the next day. The opposite direction of where we'd found those stones and that skull. We hadn't been walking for more than 5 minutes when we suddenly came across a decapitated opossum. At first, we didn't think much of it. Predators are common in the woods. Maybe a bear, like the man had warned us about, had gotten to it. But as I stepped closer, I realized the head hadn't been torn off. It had been cut. The body was untouched, and the wound was too clean. A blade had done that. Nate came to the same conclusion I did. Someone had done this. The thought sent a chill down my spine. It was grotesque. I've always felt deeply unsettled by people who hurt animals for no reason. It doesn't just make me uncomfortable. It genuinely makes me sad. Like it drains your faith in people. I tried to push that feeling down. Told Nate the best thing we could do was head back to camp, take turns sleeping, and leave that area as soon as possible. Not because we thought something would happen, but because the idea of camping between a macabre altar with a skull on one side and a headless opossum on the other, it just felt wrong, off, and unsafe. So that's what we did. We took turns sleeping through the night, one of us always keeping watch. At one point, somewhere around 3 a.m., I thought I heard leaves rustling nearby. It sounded like an animal moving around, so I stayed still and just listened. But nothing else happened. In the morning, as we packed up and made our way back toward the trail, we saw something I still have a hard time describing. We got to the spot where we'd seen the opossum, but now the head was back on the body. Only it wasn't natural. The head had been stitched back on, with what looked like some disgusting, rotting fabric or string. Something improvised and filthy. It was a sickening sight. So messed up that I had to fight the urge to vomit right there. And that's when it hit me. Those noises I'd heard during the night, that wasn't an animal. That was a person. A psychopath doing that. Whatever that was. We both agreed we had to leave immediately. The idea of being within a few miles of someone capable of doing that made my skin crawl. Who the hell does something like that? We started walking as fast as we could. We weren't admiring the trees anymore. We weren't stopping to catch our breath. We didn't even talk. The entire area had lost any beauty it once had. It was poisoned by whatever we had stumbled into. We knew there was a junction point a few miles ahead where we could reconnect with one of the main trails. As soon as we reached the main trail, we knew it would be easier to either backtrack or find an exit point from the forest where we could hitch a ride back to where the car was parked. So we just kept walking. The problem was, by nightfall, we still hadn't made it to the trail. We had to stop. Neither of us wanted to hike through the woods in the dark. The plan stayed the same. Take turns sleeping, and as soon as the sun came up, keep moving. I was the first to sleep, but around 3 a.m., Nate shook me awake in a full-blown panic, saying there was someone in the trees. I barely had time to process what he was saying before he shoved a knife into my hand. He had my gun. As my eyes adjusted and I sat up, I realized just how dark the forest was. The moonlight barely made it through the canopy. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Nate was right. We weren't alone out there. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my arm. A man, filthy, disgusting, appeared right in front of me. I didn't even have time to react. Nate swung his hiking stick with everything he had and cracked the guy across the head. The man stumbled and collapsed to the ground. He was horrifying. I've never seen anything like it. He barely looked human. There was something off, something animalistic about him. I don't even know how to explain it better than that, but that was exactly what it felt like. Like I was looking at something stuck between a man and a beast. And then it all exploded. 2 more men came charging out of the trees, just like the first one. Nate didn't hesitate. He fired the gun at them. And we ran. No looking back, no checking if they were hit. We just ran. We left everything behind, except what we had on us, and sprinted through the forest until our lungs were burning. When we finally stopped, we thought we had put some real distance between us and them. We were in a low part of the terrain, and that's when we saw them again. Standing above us on a ridge, silhouetted by the moonlight. And if I thought it couldn't get any worse, it did. None of them moved like normal people. They all had 2 legs, but it was like their bones were broken, like their knees bent the wrong way. Their movement was jerky, unnatural. I looked over at Nate, who was staring at them just like I was, and he whispered, "What the fuck are those things?" We kept running. We didn't know if they could move faster than us or not. We were completely desperate. That's when Nate pulled out the satellite phone and called the police. I could hear the panic in his voice, the gasping from running, the raw fear. He explained where we were heading, and told them we needed someone to meet us at the trail junction. I honestly didn't think we were going to make it. The faster we ran, the more I felt like they were getting closer. We were both exhausted, dehydrated, completely wrecked. I always thought I'd be the type of person who could stay calm in a situation like that. But the truth is, you don't know how you'll react until you live it. Around 8:30 that morning, we reached the meeting point, and thank God, they were there. A full search team was waiting. They hadn't ignored the call. They had really come. I can't even describe the relief I felt. Nate broke down crying, out of stress, out of fear, out of everything he'd been holding in. I'd never seen him cry before. And for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. My legs were shaking. My chest was still tight. But I was alive. And I was safe. They took us to the hospital and ran a drug test on both of us. Of course they did. I don't blame them. If someone told me this story, I'd probably think they were either insane or high out of their mind. But the tests came back clean. That's when the cops launched a full manhunt. Apparently, 5 people had gone missing in that area over the past few months, and there was already an open investigation. Our account just confirmed that something seriously wrong was happening out there. A few days later, they told us they found an altar, just like the one we described, but miles away from the one we'd originally seen. And now, 2 more people are missing. A couple. To this day, the police still have no answers, no suspects, no real explanation for what we saw. But I know what I saw. And I know we weren't supposed to leave those woods alive. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're heading deep into the remote stretches of the Appalachian Mountains to explore 2 stories that really stuck with me. The moment I received them, I knew they belonged on the channel. The first is about a roommate, someone who seemed normal at first, but was clearly hiding something much darker beneath the surface. The second follows a man who is trying to escape a dangerous situation, but runs into the woods, and ends up finding something he never expected. I hope you find these stories as gripping as I did when I first came across them. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened 4 years ago, right as I was finishing my master's degree. I'm a historian, and I've always been deeply fascinated by the intersection between fantasy, folklore, and reality. There's absolutely no place on Earth that captivates me more than the Appalachian Mountains. I think most of you already know why. But if you don't, well, let me just say this. It's one of the most enigmatic regions on the face of the Earth, and I consume every piece of content I can find about it. The university where I did my master's had a summer internship program that allowed students to spend a few months exploring the specific area they wanted to base their thesis on. So naturally, I didn't miss the chance to spend my summer up in the mountains. The school covered almost everything in terms of expenses, but the place they found for me to stay was too far from the area I really wanted to study, so I ended up trying to find something on my own for the summer. And contrary to what I initially thought, there were actually quite a few options available, but every single one of them was more expensive than I could afford. Time was running out, and I wasn't finding anything suitable, and since I was getting a little desperate, I did something I knew I probably shouldn't have done. I came across a random post on Reddit from a guy who was renting out one of the rooms in his house. I reached out directly, and the price was so good that I accepted without thinking twice, and without checking whether it was actually legit. The house was a bit more isolated than I'd expected, but honestly, that was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted the full experience of being somewhere truly remote. When the day finally came and I arrived, I was nervous. I hadn't seen a single photo and was basically putting my trust in a complete stranger. But when I got there and saw that the house was real and the guy actually existed, I was so relieved that I ignored the fact that he was incredibly strange. The way he spoke and moved his hands felt like he was performing, like he was trying a little too hard to come off as friendly. I told myself he was probably just an odd person who lived alone in the middle of nowhere, and that kind of thing can make people weird sometimes. But after a few days, I started to get genuinely freaked out. His name was Derek, but he insisted, almost aggressively, that I call him Danny. Sometimes he'd be overly friendly, almost uncomfortably so, and other times he acted like I didn't even exist. What was most bizarre were the rules. The house had 3 floors, a basement, the main floor with the kitchen, living room and bathroom, and then the upstairs bedrooms. Not that I had any interest in going into the basement, but the way he forbade it was strange. Even after I told him multiple times that I had no interest in going down there, he reminded me almost every single day. It was like he wanted me to get curious and go. Like he was planting the idea on purpose. His schedule was weird too. He'd leave the house multiple times after 11 p.m., and I'd hear him come back only around dawn. But he never took the car. He always walked. We were surrounded by nothing but forest, totally isolated, and there was nowhere to go out there. At least, nowhere I knew of. But he had never been aggressive. At least, not until the night he caught me in the kitchen at 3 a.m. I knew he was out. I'd heard him leave around 11:30. That night, I was struggling to fall asleep. So around 3 a.m., I got up to grab a glass of water. He caught me standing in the kitchen and completely lost it. He started accusing me of sneaking down into the basement, of trying to figure out what he was hiding down there. He said I didn't know how to respect his boundaries. I kept trying to explain that I'd just come down to get a drink of water, but it didn't matter. He was getting more and more unhinged, so I just went back to my room. It took me a while to fall asleep, but I eventually did. Then I woke up around 5:30 in the morning with a strange feeling. I rolled over in bed, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting at the foot of my bed just staring at me. I jumped up in a panic and asked him what the hell he was doing in my room. By then, he seemed much calmer and said he just wanted to apologize, that he knew I hadn't gone into the basement. That completely threw me. I told him he couldn't just come into my room like that, for any reason. He stared at me for a long while, like he didn't quite understand what I had just said. Then he got up and walked out. That reaction unsettled me more than anything else. I think I would have preferred if he'd stayed angry, because that weird, silent look he gave me was much harder to process. And then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. I always locked my door. I always did, especially with a roommate like him. When I asked him later that morning how he got into my room, he looked caught off guard. Then he said the door had been open, that he knocked and I didn't answer, so he came in. I knew both of those were lies. I never left my door unlocked, and I'm a light sleeper. If he'd knocked, I would have woken up. Still, I let it go. I had another area I wanted to explore that day, and later, I planned to hit the library. I wasn't going to let him ruin my day. But as I started hiking through the forest, I began to get that feeling again. That same eerie sensation I'd had a couple of times before in that area. Like I was being watched. Like I wasn't alone out there. I study folklore, and my favorite thing about it is how it connects to reality, and how that reality can sometimes get twisted. But this feeling, it was intense, it was persistent, and it felt completely real. I stopped for a bit by a creek, barely 10 minutes into the walk, which meant I was still relatively close to the house. I seriously considered turning back early and just heading to the library. But that's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure off to my right, moving slowly in the opposite direction. Whoever it was, they were standing in a shadowed area, so visibility was low. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the thought that he had followed me. I didn't know this man at all, and his behavior was getting more and more disturbing. I still had no idea what he was hiding in that basement, and here I was, completely alone and isolated with him out in the middle of nowhere. As I walked back toward the house, I kept telling myself, I'd never put myself in that kind of situation again. But just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, that night, they did. I hadn't heard him leave, so I assumed he was either still in his room or maybe in the basement. I went downstairs to eat dinner, and at some point I heard his bedroom door open and close, followed by the sound of another door, probably the bathroom. When I headed back upstairs, I figured he was still in the bathroom, since I hadn't heard his door again. But when I walked past, the bathroom door was wide open and the light was off. Without a second thought, I went to my room, locked the door from the inside like always, and put on some YouTube videos. I wanted to get to sleep early, but listening to someone talking always helped calm me down. I was almost asleep when I heard it. A muffled sneeze. It was so quiet, it was barely noticeable, but it was definitely real. Someone was in the room with me. I jumped up, grabbed my phone, and as I reached for my car keys, I saw him. Crawling out from under the bed. That image is burned into my brain. Without thinking, I bolted out of the room, ran through the house, jumped in my car, and floored it out of there as fast as I could. Even as I drove, the image of him slithering out from under the bed haunted me. What the hell was he doing there? What was the point of all of this? A few days later, I got an email from him saying I owed him the last month's rent. I couldn't believe the audacity. So I replied and told him if he ever contacted me again, I'd go straight to the police. As you can probably imagine, I never heard from him again. I've lived my whole life here in West Virginia. Some say it's the scariest state in the country. Others say it's the most beautiful. There are days when I believe the first, and others when I believe the second. I know what happened to me about 2 weeks ago could have taken place anywhere, but the fact that it happened in a completely isolated spot, right in the middle of the Appalachians, makes it all the more terrifying. I moved into the house where I live now 3 years ago. I've always lived a pretty isolated life. My parents had a small farm a few miles away from here, and the nearest neighbor was still a good drive from the house. So, the isolation itself was never really a problem. The real problem was the forest. I always respected it, and I always knew there were things living in it that were hard to explain. That's why I followed those basic rules to the letter. Don't go out after dark. Don't respond to strange sounds. Don't break the silence unless you absolutely have to. I was always careful. On the day it all happened, the plan was to stay home in the evening. I was exhausted and really just needed to rest. But one of my best friends had a delay at work and asked if I could pick up his son from school. Since I was already going out, I figured I might as well take the opportunity to get some groceries too. I was running low on just about everything, and I'd been reheating the same meal for the past 2 days. From my house to the center of town, it's about 16 miles. So anytime I make the trip, I try to make it count. The plan was pretty simple. Pick up the kid around 5 p.m., make a quick stop at Walmart before it closed, and then head home. I got to the school at about 4:50 and waited for the kid to come out. I was killing time on my phone when I noticed a car parked at a distance. I remembered it because I'd seen it about 2 weeks earlier in a parking lot. It was a black Lada, something you almost never see around here. I've always liked the brand, but they're incredibly rare in this part of the country. I didn't think too much of it at the time, just noted it and went back to my phone. Around 5:05, the kid showed up, and we headed over to Walmart. One thing I never realized before is that when you're with someone else's kid, you become paranoid. I started noticing a man in a flannel shirt and a baseball cap. Yeah, I know, couldn't be more cliché. But what made me notice him wasn't how he looked. It was the fact that I kept seeing him in every single aisle we went down. It genuinely felt like he was following us, and it didn't seem like he was trying very hard to hide it either. I thought about talking to the security, but I didn't really have any proof, and I didn't want to cause a scene. So I decided to cut the shopping short and get out of there. I figured I could come back another day, alone. As we walked out into the parking lot, I spotted the guy again. He was already outside, standing near one of the cars. I considered confronting him. But again, I had nothing concrete, and the last thing I wanted was to escalate anything, especially with a kid beside me. So I got into the car and got out of there as fast as I could. That's when I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man walking toward a vehicle, and realized it was the same Lada I'd seen before, both earlier that day and 2 weeks earlier. I decided I had to talk to my friend. I had to tell him that someone had been following his kid. I told him I'd go with him to the police if that's what he wanted. I could give a solid description of the guy, and Walmart surely had footage of everything. But it's not an easy thing to tell a parent, so I ended up staying at his house later than I'd planned. We talked about what I saw, about the man, about the car, and agreed to go to the police the next morning. The kid would stay home with his mom while we went to the station, so I left his place around 10:30 p.m. As I mentioned, I live 16 miles outside of town, on a dirt road that cuts straight through the forest. I always take it slow to avoid damaging the car. But that night, I was tired, and I just wanted to be home. So I pushed the speed a bit. It was already dark by then, and like I said before, I hate being out there after sundown, not even in my own yard. I never go outside after nightfall. The moment I pulled in, I made sure the car was locked and quickly made my way to the front door. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was the smell. Something foul that I couldn't quite place, but definitely unpleasant, like a mix of sweat and dampness. I got worried it might be coming from me, so I figured I'd shower before bed. As I made my way upstairs, I realized the light in my bedroom was on. That struck me as odd. I was pretty sure I'd turned it off. But it had still been daylight when I left, so I told myself I could have just forgotten. I started heading up the stairs, but halfway up I heard the floorboards creak inside my room. And in that instant, everything clicked. Someone was in the house, and that smell. It wasn't me. That light, I hadn't left it on. As quietly as I could, I backed down the stairs and headed for the kitchen. I needed something to defend myself with, and my gun was in the bedroom. That's when I saw the kitchen window had been smashed wide open. That's how they got in. Outside was pitch black. I couldn't see anything. But then, suddenly, a pair of headlights turned on, blinding me through the broken glass. Whoever was inside my house wasn't alone. When I saw the car, it all made sense. They weren't after the kid. They were after me. But how did they know where I lived? And how long had they been following me, planning that break-in at my house? Then I heard a voice from upstairs. A man's voice, calm but certain, saying I had nowhere to run. My brain was still trying to catch up when I realized he was right. There wasn't anywhere inside the house I could go that they couldn't reach if they really wanted to, and there were at least 2 men, maybe more. The house was surrounded by forest, and that's when I realized No matter how much the forest scared me, it didn't compare to the fear of having dangerous people hunting me down. Their car was parked around the back, which is why I hadn't seen it when I pulled in. If I ran out the front door, maybe I'd have enough of a head start to make it into the woods before they caught up. I bolted through the front door and sprinted as fast as I could straight into the tree line. I knew that forest. I may not have ever been deep in it at night, but it was still my territory. I knew it well in daylight, and that counted for something. I heard one man shouting to the other, then the sound of the car revving and following in my direction. I didn't stop when I hit the edge of the forest. I kept running between the trees. Not far from where I was, there's a stream that leads into a small cave. While I ran, I called 911. The dispatcher told me the nearest unit would take at least 17 minutes to reach me, but they were on their way. They asked me to stay on the line, but by then I couldn't hear anything but the sounds of the forest around me. I could hear the men too, off in the distance, moving. But more than that, I began to hear a kind of murmuring. I don't know how to explain it, but I know it came from the forest itself. At first, the murmuring lingered close. So close I could almost feel it. But then, slowly, it began to drift away, pulling itself through the trees in the direction of the men. I can't explain how I knew, but I felt it. Felt it moving toward them. I heard them shouting, then a gunshot. And then silence. Absolute, unnatural silence. And the forest went still. The murmuring was gone. Even the night insects had gone quiet. I didn't come out of that small hole in the rocks until I heard the police sirens in the distance. And the walk back to the house was completely silent. I could hear the sirens approaching, and through the phone still clutched in my hand, I could hear the dispatcher calling my name. But I couldn't answer. I was as still and silent as the forest itself. I didn't make a sound. It took me several minutes after stepping out of the woods to even begin to explain to the police who I was and what had happened. The car was still there, but the men were gone. Since that night, they've searched the woods again and again, but found nothing. They just vanished. I didn't tell the police what I heard out there. They'd think I was crazy. And maybe I am. I have no explanation for what happened. And I don't usually believe in things I can't explain, no matter how much I respect the forest. But I know something happened. And I think that the forest protected me. As crazy as that may sound, it reminds me of something my great uncle used to say all the time. The forest has ways of protecting its own. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
My name is Josh, and the story I'm about to tell you is about the Witch of Hines Road. Fair warning, I'm a huge history nerd when it comes to digging into the facts and telling things exactly as they happened. So, before I get to the part where I tell you what happened to me, I want to give you a little background on the legend itself. I hope it's not too boring, but if it is, please bear with me. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by the stories people tell in the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up surrounded by them. Around here, legends aren't just something you hear around a campfire. They're part of everyday life. They're passed from grandparents to grandchildren, whispered across front porches, repeated in old diners, and shared by people who swear they either experienced something themselves or knew someone who did. The older I got, the more I realized that these mountains have a way of holding on to their history. Some stories disappear with time, while others seem to become stronger every generation. And one thing I've learned after spending years exploring these places is that almost every legend begins with a real person. Somewhere beneath all the fear, all the rumors, and all the exaggeration, there is usually someone whose life was turned into something they never actually were. When you grow up in small, isolated communities tucked deep into the Appalachians, you also begin to notice another pattern. Throughout history, women who lived differently were almost always viewed with suspicion. If a woman preferred living alone, understood the forest better than most people, gathered medicinal plants, treated illnesses with herbs, or simply refused to live according to what everyone else expected, it rarely took long before the rumors started. Suddenly, she wasn't just knowledgeable anymore. She became strange and dangerous. People began blaming her for things that made no sense. A failed harvest, sick livestock, children getting lost in the woods, unexplained deaths. Entire communities often found it easier to point at one woman than accept that tragedy is simply part of life. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder how many of the so-called witches throughout Appalachian history were nothing more than healers, midwives, or women who understood nature far better than the people accusing them. Personally, I think modern society has done these women another disservice. Over time, we've replaced generations of traditional knowledge with products sold by enormous corporations, and somewhere along the way, we also erased the people who spent their lives learning directly from the land. I'm not saying every old remedy worked, and I'm certainly not claiming every story was completely innocent. Like any period in history, there were undoubtedly people capable of terrible things. But I do believe many women were turned into monsters simply because they lived outside what society considered acceptable. That's just my perspective, though. Everyone is free to reach their own conclusions after hearing the evidence. Because of that, I've spent years visiting places connected to some of the most infamous legends in Appalachia. I don't go there hoping to prove ghosts exist or to convince people that every local story is true. What interests me far more is understanding how those stories were born in the first place. I like digging through old records, newspaper archives, family histories, cemetery documents, and forgotten local accounts to separate actual history from folklore. Sometimes I discover that the legends are surprisingly accurate. Other times, I realize they're nothing more than generations of rumors stacked on top of one another until nobody remembers where the truth actually ended. One investigation in particular has stayed with me more than almost any other. It's the legend of the Hines Road Witch, a story that has terrified people in northeastern Alabama for decades and somehow found its way into countless books, paranormal documentaries, YouTube videos, and local ghost stories. Depending on who you ask, The witch was responsible for kidnapping children, murdering travelers, sacrificing victims inside a cave hidden in the woods, bathing in their blood, and dumping their bodies into a nearby pond that supposedly turned bright red. Other people claim she summoned enormous black hellhounds with glowing red eyes that still roam the forest at night. Some insist she cursed everyone responsible for her death after an angry mob trapped her inside her cabin and burned it to the ground. Others swear that drivers still experience unexplained car trouble on Hines Road. That thick fog suddenly appears on perfectly clear nights. That voices call people deeper into the woods. And that the witch herself still wanders near the pond, waiting for anyone reckless enough to follow her. It's an incredible story, the kind of story that immediately grabs your attention. But the more I looked into it, the more complicated it became. Almost every version contradicted the one before it. Different names kept appearing, different locations, different dates, different victims. Some people called the woman Sarah Torbett. Others insisted her last name was Torbett or Talbot. Some claimed she lived beside the pond everyone now visits. Others placed her somewhere entirely different. Even the cave connected to the legend wasn't always the same cave, depending on who was telling the story. Before long, I realized I wasn't investigating one woman anymore. I was investigating decades of overlapping rumors that had somehow merged multiple real families and real locations into one terrifying legend. What makes this story even more fascinating is that Sarah Ellen Elizabeth Torbett was actually a real person. She wasn't born in Alabama at all. She was born in 1866, eventually moved to Texas, and spent much of her life surrounded by medicine. Several of her brothers became doctors. Her husband was also a physician, and together they operated an alternative medicine practice focused on mineral springs and natural healing. Somehow, over the decades, her name became attached to a completely different story hundreds of miles away. At the same time, another woman who lived beside Clayton Pond had a large black dog known for protecting her property. A completely separate family living near another pond became tangled into the legend simply because they shared the same last name. Yet another woman who lived in a shack nearby and frightened people by yelling at trespassers also became part of the story. Piece by piece, different lives were stitched together until the original people almost disappeared, completely beneath the mythology. By the time I arrived at Hines Road myself, I honestly didn't know what I believed anymore. On paper, almost every major part of the legend seemed to fall apart under historical research. There was no reliable evidence that an angry mob burned a witch alive in 1939. There were no documented missing children connected to these families. The famous blood-red pond had perfectly ordinary explanations. Even the supposed drownings likely came from locals witnessing baptisms that regularly took place in the pond decades ago. Almost every terrifying claim seemed to have a perfectly reasonable historical origin once I started digging. And yet, despite all of that, one question refused to go away. If the legend was built almost entirely from misunderstandings, coincidences, and decades of distorted storytelling, why do so many people still insist that something is deeply wrong with that place? That's exactly what I wanted to find out. If you've ever looked up pictures of Hines Road, you'll probably notice that, at first glance, there's nothing particularly remarkable about it. The pond itself is actually fairly small compared to what most people imagine after hearing the legend. It's tucked away in a quiet part of the Appalachians, surrounded by trees, and if you had no idea about its history, you'd probably drive right past it without thinking twice. Unfortunately, over the years, the place has also attracted exactly the kind of people you'd expect. Some visitors leave trash behind, others carve symbols into the surrounding trees, or leave handwritten notes scattered around the shoreline. While I was walking around the pond that afternoon, I picked up one of those pieces of paper out of curiosity, expecting it to be another fake ritual or some teenager trying to be edgy. Instead, it contained a handwritten death threat directed at someone by name, claiming that one day they would be thrown into that very pond. It was disturbing, but at the same time, it perfectly reflected what the legend had become. People weren't just visiting because they believed the stories anymore. Some were actively using the location to fuel their own obsession. My plan couldn't have been simpler. I wasn't there looking for ghosts, demons, or anything like that. I wanted to spend the night close enough to the pond to see whether any of the stories had even the slightest basis in reality. If the water really turned red after dark, I wanted to witness it myself. If people truly heard dogs barking where no dog should exist, I wanted to hear it. If there was anything unusual about the place, I wanted to experience it firsthand instead of relying on stories passed around the internet. I wouldn't say I believe in the supernatural, but I also wouldn't say I dismiss it completely. I've always tried to keep an open mind. I prefer evidence, things that can actually be documented and verified, but I also recognize that history is full of events people couldn't explain until science eventually caught up. My grandmother used to tell me that the supernatural is only supernatural until science figures out how it works. And for some reason, that idea has always stayed with me. I had brought a small backpacking tent and decided to camp reasonably close to the pond without being directly visible from the trail. Even though the area isn't exactly crowded, people still stop by throughout the day, especially those hoping to experience something paranormal for themselves. I had no interest in spending the evening dealing with curious strangers or internet ghost hunters. I found a spot hidden by thick vegetation, pitched my tent in less than 15 minutes, organized my gear, and spent the next hour simply listening to the forest settle into darkness. The sun disappears quickly in these mountains. 1 minute, everything is covered in warm orange light, and the next, you're surrounded by almost complete darkness, broken only by the beam of your flashlight. I had been there for maybe an hour and a half when I heard the first scream. It immediately caught my attention because it wasn't the kind of scream someone makes while joking around or trying to scare their friends. It sounded raw, panicked, human. My heart started pounding almost instantly, and for a brief second, I even wondered whether every ridiculous story surrounding this place had somehow been true all along. I grabbed my flashlight and my sidearm, left the tent behind, and began moving through the vegetation as quietly as I could. The closer I got, the more I realized the scream had only been the loudest sound. Underneath it, there were multiple voices. Several people were talking at once, some calmly, others much louder, almost as though they were arguing over something. I moved close enough to safely look through the trees without exposing myself, and what I saw immediately convinced me that something was very wrong. There were at least a dozen people gathered together, every one of them dressed entirely in white robes that almost glowed beneath their flashlights. In the center of the group were a man and a woman lying on what looked like an improvised wooden stretcher. The man was yelling constantly, struggling against the people carrying him, while the woman barely moved at all. Whether she had fainted, been drugged, or was simply too exhausted to react, I couldn't tell. The entire scene looked like something pulled straight out of a horror movie. Nobody appeared to notice me, and I wasn't interested in finding out what would happen if they did. I backed away as carefully as I could, returned to my campsite without making unnecessary noise, and immediately grabbed the one thing I couldn't believe I'd forgotten when I first left the tent: my satellite phone. Looking back, I still have no idea why I'd left it behind. My first instinct had been to investigate, not realizing I was walking towards something that looked disturbingly organized. I contacted emergency services as quickly as I could, explained exactly where I was, described everything I'd witnessed, and stayed hidden while waiting for law enforcement to arrive. To my surprise, they got there much faster than I expected. Several patrol vehicles pulled into the access road leading toward the pond, and officers made their way into the woods. I stayed well back from the area because the last thing I wanted was for anyone in that group to recognize my face. By then, I'd already packed almost everything I owned back into my truck. There was no chance I was spending another night anywhere near that place. About half an hour later, 2 deputies walked back toward me. What they told me left me feeling relieved and deeply unsettled at exactly the same time. According to them, there was no evidence whatsoever that anyone had been assaulted or held against their will. Every single person involved insisted they were participating voluntarily in what they described as a private religious ceremony. Both individuals on the stretcher confirmed they had agreed to everything beforehand. No crimes had been committed. Nobody requested help. Legally, there was nothing the officers could do beyond documenting the encounter and making sure everyone dispersed peacefully. Part of me felt enormous relief because I'd been convinced I'd just witnessed a kidnapping or something even worse. Another part of me couldn't stop thinking about how incredibly disturbing the entire scene had been. A dozen people dressed in white robes. A woman who barely appeared conscious. A man screaming while being carried through the woods at night. Even if nobody had technically broken the law, nothing about what I'd seen felt remotely normal. I drove home that same night and did everything I could to put the experience behind me, convincing myself it had simply been one of those bizarre situations you occasionally stumble across while exploring remote places. I live in a pretty isolated part of Appalachia myself. My nearest neighbor is only a few minutes away on foot, but dense forest separates our properties so completely that neither of us can even see the other's house through the trees. That's fairly normal around here. Everyone knows everyone in town. We help each other whenever we need to. But once you get home, you're mostly surrounded by woods. Less than a week after that trip, someone came to my house. It was well after dark. I was sitting in my living room watching television when I heard a knock at the front door. At the time, I didn't have a security camera installed, something I'd been meaning to do for years, but kept putting off. I walked over quietly and looked through the peephole. Standing on my porch was a man dressed completely in white. He wore a plain white mask that covered his entire face, white gloves, white boots, and what looked like the same kind of robe I'd seen beside the pond. He never tried forcing the door open. He never shouted. He simply stood there perfectly still before calmly speaking through the closed door. He said he knew exactly who I was. He said he belonged to the same Christian brotherhood that had gathered on Hines Road that night. He knew I had called the police. He knew where I lived. Then he explained, in the calmest voice imaginable, that their purpose was to punish people who rejected God's path. According to him, they believed society had embraced witchcraft, devil worship, false religions, and every kind of moral corruption imaginable, and they considered it their responsibility to identify those people before God eventually judged them himself. As you can probably imagine, I was completely stunned by the audacity of someone showing up at my front door, dressed like that, calmly saying everything he had just said. And when I tell you that I knew, without the slightest doubt, that every single word was meant as a threat, I'm not exaggerating. He never actually said anything that would have gotten him arrested if I'd happened to be recording the conversation. He was careful. Every sentence was vague enough to sound almost harmless on its own, but when you put everything together, there was absolutely no question about what he was trying to communicate. He wanted me to know that they had found me. He wanted me to understand that they knew where I lived. Most importantly, he wanted me to be afraid. The only thing I could think to ask was why he was hiding behind a mask. If he believed so strongly in what he was doing, why wasn't he willing to show his face? There was a long pause before he answered. Then, in the calmest voice imaginable, he told me that I didn't need to see who he was because he already knew exactly who I was. He knew my face. He knew my name. He knew where I lived. Hearing someone say those words while standing outside your home in the middle of the night changes something inside you. It stops feeling like a strange encounter and starts feeling personal. At that point, I told him he needed to leave my property immediately. I said that if he stayed another minute, I was calling the police and reporting him for criminal trespassing and harassment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply tilted his head slightly and told me to be very careful because members of the Brotherhood already knew exactly who I was. Then he said something that has replayed in my mind almost every day since. He warned me that, sooner or later, I could find myself in exactly the same position as the people I had seen at the lake. The way he said it made my stomach drop. Up until that moment, I'd still been trying to convince myself that maybe the deputies had been right, that maybe everyone there had truly been participating willingly. But hearing him say that immediately brought back the man's screams echoing through the woods that night. Those weren't the screams of someone taking part in a harmless ceremony. Without really thinking, I asked him a question that had been bothering me ever since I'd left Hines Road. Why that lake? Why perform those rituals there of all places? He seemed caught off guard for the first time since the conversation had started. He stood there silently for several seconds before finally answering. According to him, the lake attracted exactly the kind of people they were looking for. People fascinated by witches, people interested in the occult, people who glorified the devil, paganism, or anything they considered opposed to God. Then he brought up something that sent another chill down my spine. He said they knew about my investigation. He knew why I'd gone there. He told me that researching and questioning the legend was exactly the sort of behavior they believed encouraged evil, and that I needed to think very carefully about the path I was choosing, because people like me were already being watched. Once again, he never directly threatened to hurt me. He didn't have to. Every sentence carried exactly the same message. The second he walked away from my porch, I called the police. Under normal circumstances, I might have waited until morning, but this wasn't normal anymore. I specifically asked for the same deputies who had responded at Hines Road because I wanted them to understand that maybe, just maybe, what I'd witnessed out there hadn't been as harmless as everyone initially believed. They arrived fairly quickly, searched around my property, checked the surrounding roads, and took another statement from me. But whoever had been standing outside my house had vanished without leaving a trace. What frustrated me most was the response I received afterward. The deputies told me that, based on everything I'd described, the man hadn't technically committed a crime simply by coming onto my porch and attempting to share his religious beliefs. Unless they could prove he'd made a direct criminal threat or refused to leave after being instructed to do so, there wasn't much they could realistically charge him with. I also couldn't help noticing that one of the deputies seemed unusually quick to dismiss everything as nothing more than a disagreement over religion. I want to be very clear here because this part is important. I'm not trying to start any kind of religious argument. People are free to believe whatever they want, and I respect that completely. This isn't about Christianity or Catholicism. This is about a group of extremists using religion as a justification to intimidate and terrorize people. Those are two completely different things. Every belief system has fringe groups capable of terrible acts, and in my opinion, organizations like this deserve to be investigated regardless of what religion they claim to represent. It's now been almost 2 months since that first visit, and things haven't gotten better. If anything, they've escalated. I've repeatedly noticed people parked near my property watching my house for long periods of time. More than once, I've spotted individuals dressed entirely in white, standing just beyond the tree line before disappearing the moment I stepped outside. I've called the police several different times. Every single time they arrive, whoever was there is already gone. I've even reached the point where I've had to walk outside armed and order people off my property myself, something I absolutely hate doing because it's not who I am, and it's never how I wanted to live. But when strangers repeatedly show up wearing masks, watching your home, and making it clear they know exactly where you live, you eventually stop thinking about being polite and start thinking about staying alive. At this point, I honestly don't know what I'm supposed to do next. The police don't seem to have enough evidence to act. The intimidation hasn't stopped. The people responsible never show their faces, never leave enough proof behind, and never cross the line quite far enough for anyone to intervene before they disappear again. All I know is that I went to Hines Road expecting to investigate an old ghost story, and instead I stumbled into something that, in my opinion, is far more frightening than anything supernatural could ever be. Everything I'm about to tell you happened during a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains in eastern Kentucky, a little over 4 years ago. I've spent most of my adult life hiking long-distance trails, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the mountains demand respect. They don't care how experienced you are, how expensive your gear is, or how many survival courses you've taken. The moment you stop respecting them, they'll remind you exactly where you stand. That trip wasn't supposed to be anything special. I had taken a week off work because I needed to clear my head after a rough couple of months, and I wanted a trail that was quiet enough for me to spend long stretches without seeing another person. I wasn't looking for adventure. I wasn't chasing ghost stories. I certainly wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted 7 peaceful days walking through forests that felt older than civilization itself. Looking back now, I wish I had picked literally anywhere else. The first day's hike went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, the trail was in decent condition, and I reached the first backcountry shelter a little before sunset. It was one of those old 3-sided wooden shelters the Forest Service maintains for hikers. Nothing fancy, just enough to get you out of the rain if the weather turns bad. There was nobody there when I arrived, so I claimed one corner, unpacked my sleeping bag, cooked a simple dinner, and settled in to read for a while before calling it a night. By the time darkness settled over the mountains, the forest had become almost unnaturally quiet. The only sounds left were insects, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the wind moving through trees that looked like they had been standing there for centuries. Around 11 o'clock, just as I was thinking about turning in, I heard footsteps coming up the trail. A few seconds later, another backpacker appeared with a headlamp, carrying a pack that looked like it weighed almost as much as he did. He was probably somewhere in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a thick gray beard, worn hiking boots that had clearly seen thousands of miles, and one of those faces that immediately puts you at ease. He apologized for arriving so late, asked if I minded sharing the shelter, and thanked me before even setting his backpack down. There was something incredibly genuine about him. We started talking while he unpacked his gear, and before long, it felt less like I had met a complete stranger, and more like I was catching up with someone I'd known for years. He had hiked almost every major trail in the eastern United States, and seemed to have a story for every mountain range, every abandoned fire tower, every forgotten mining town tucked away somewhere in Appalachia. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He spoke the way older mountain people often do, slowly, carefully, almost as if every story deserved to be told properly instead of rushed. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward Appalachian folklore. I admitted I'd always loved reading about old mountain legends, even if I didn't necessarily believe any of them. And that was when he smiled in a way I still remember today. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives because they're about to scare you. It was more like someone remembering a story they'd been carrying around for most of their life. He told me there was one legend his grandfather had refused to tell inside the house because he believed saying its name indoors invited bad luck. He laughed at himself before admitting he never believed that part, but he still found himself avoiding it out of habit. Then he leaned back against one of the shelter posts and began telling me about the Talipo. According to him, the story dated back generations in these mountains, long before paved roads or state parks existed. It wasn't really a ghost story, at least not in the traditional sense. It was more of a warning disguised as folklore. The legend claimed that a hunter living alone deep in the mountains had returned home one winter evening with almost no food left. As night fell, a strange animal wandered into his cabin. Nobody could agree what it actually looked like because every version described it differently, but everyone agreed on one thing. It had an unusually long, thick tail. Desperate for something to eat, the hunter killed the creature, chopped off its tail, and cooked it over the fire. It was the only meal he had left. That night, just as he drifted off to sleep, he heard something outside his cabin. At first, it sounded like leaves scraping across the ground, then branches snapping, then footsteps circling the cabin over and over again. Finally came a voice. Quiet at first, almost impossible to make out, but slowly becoming clearer every time it passed beneath the windows. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't growling. It sounded patient, calm, almost polite. It repeated the same sentence again and again, asking who had taken its talipo. The following night, the voice came back, this time closer, louder. It wandered around the cabin for hours, repeating those same words without ever changing its tone. By the third night, the footsteps reached the front porch. The voice was no longer outside, somewhere in the darkness. It was standing directly beyond the door. According to every version of the legend, the hunter was eventually found missing without a trace. The only thing left behind inside the cabin was the fireplace, still warm, and claw marks running across the wooden floor toward the door. He explained that parents had been telling children that story throughout Appalachia for generations. On the surface, it sounded like a simple monster tale meant to scare kids into behaving, but older mountain families viewed it differently. To them, the talipo represented greed, disrespect for nature, and the belief that taking something which doesn't belong to you always comes with consequences. His grandfather used to say that the creature itself wasn't even the frightening part. The frightening part was the certainty with which it came back. It never forgot. It never forgave. It simply kept searching until it found exactly what had been taken from it. He chuckled after finishing the story and admitted he hadn't thought about it in years, then wished me a good night, rolled into his sleeping bag, and within minutes I could hear him snoring softly. I don't know whether it was the story itself or simply the atmosphere of those mountains, but I remember lying awake much longer than I normally would. Every ordinary sound seemed just a little more noticeable after that. A squirrel moving through leaves sounded heavier than it should have. Wind brushing against branches almost resembled footsteps if I let my imagination wander too far. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off to sleep. When I woke up just before sunrise, the shelter was empty. At first, I assumed he'd already packed up and continued hiking. There was nothing particularly strange about that. Plenty of backpackers start before daylight to avoid hiking during the hottest part of the day. Still, something felt off. His entire sleeping area was spotless, almost unnaturally so. There wasn't a single footprint in the damp dirt behind the shelter where he'd unpacked his gear the night before. No coffee smell lingering in the air. No sound of someone walking away on the trail. It was simply as though he'd vanished between the moment I fell asleep and the moment I opened my eyes. I shrugged it off because there wasn't really another explanation, packed my own gear, and continued down the trail, telling myself I was letting an old campfire story get inside my head. The rest of that day went smoothly, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. It wasn't because I believed anything supernatural had happened. It was because I realized how unusual it was that someone I'd spent nearly 2 hours talking with could disappear so completely without leaving behind the slightest sign he'd ever been there. Every now and then, I'd catch myself looking farther down the trail, expecting to see him again. I never did. By late afternoon, I reached another shelter several miles away, cooked dinner, watched the sun disappear behind endless ridges, and settled in for another quiet night. Nothing unusual happened, at least nothing I could point to. There were moments when I'd glance into the woods because I thought I'd seen movement in my peripheral vision, but every time it turned out to be nothing more than branches moving in the wind. Once or twice, I had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing deeper in the trees watching me. Yet whenever I actually looked, there was nothing there. I blamed the story. That's exactly what stories like that do. They plant a tiny seed in the back of your mind, and suddenly every perfectly ordinary forest noise feels slightly different. By the third evening, I had almost convinced myself I'd been ridiculous. I'd covered another long stretch of trail, reached a small shelter overlooking a narrow valley, made myself dinner, and even laughed at how much that old legend had gotten under my skin. Around midnight, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. Anyone who spent enough time backpacking knows the routine. You grab your flashlight, walk a safe distance away from camp, do what you need to do, and head straight back before your body fully realizes how cold the night actually is. I had barely stepped beyond the edge of the shelter when I heard it. The voice wasn't loud. If anything, it was so quiet that I almost convinced myself it had come from somewhere inside my own head. It drifted through the trees from somewhere downhill, calm enough that it never sounded like shouting, yet clear enough that there was absolutely no mistaking the words. It slowly asked who had taken its talipo. Every hair on my arm stood up before I even processed what I'd heard. I didn't shine my flashlight toward the trees. I didn't call out. I didn't investigate. Every instinct I had told me to get back inside that shelter immediately. As I turned around, I caught the unmistakable feeling that something farther down the slope had shifted. Not running, not charging, just moving, quietly. The woods had become completely silent. Even the insects had stopped. I climbed back into my sleeping bag, fully dressed, kept my flashlight in one hand for the rest of the night, and never slept another minute. At first light, I packed faster than I ever have on any hiking trip before or since. I skipped breakfast, ignored the rest of my planned route, hiked straight back to my truck, and drove home without making another stop. I've replayed that night in my head countless times over the years. Maybe another hiker knew the story and decided to play a cruel joke. Maybe I dreamed the entire thing while I was half asleep. Maybe my brain mixed that old man's story with ordinary forest sounds and created something that never happened. Every explanation seems reasonable until I remember how unmistakably human that voice sounded, and how impossible it is to mistake those particular words after hearing the legend only 2 nights earlier. I still hike the Appalachians several times a year because I refuse to let one experience ruin something I've loved my entire life. Even so, whenever someone I've never met starts talking about old mountain folklore around a campfire, I politely listen, wish them a good night, and make sure I'm hiking again before sunrise. Some stories belong in books, some belong around campfires, and every now and then you walk away wondering whether one of them followed you farther down the trail than you realized.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into two of the most recent stories I've received, both still unfolding to this day. Each one centers around someone who decided to buy a home in the Appalachian Mountains, but things haven't exactly gone as planned. From completely unhinged people breaking into homes, to strange things moving through the woods, these stories are far from over. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. My wife and I moved into the Appalachians a little over 3 months ago. We left city life behind, Louisville to be exact, for something slower and quieter. I work remotely now, tech stuff, so the location didn't matter. Leah had been pushing for years to get closer to nature. We found a 2-bedroom cabin on about 3 acres of land, just off a long, winding mountain road in western North Carolina. It backs up to a steep, wooded ridge, thick with pines and silence. My wife grew up very close to this area and spent a large part of her childhood playing in the Appalachian forests. So ever since she went off to college and ended up living with me in the city, it was like the forest had been calling her back. We always knew that sooner or later we would try to live out here. So when we finally made it happen, for her, it was like a dream come true. The closest neighbor is half a mile down the road. That was one of our favorite parts about living there. We liked the space, the fresh air, the sound of wind in the trees instead of traffic and sirens. On top of that, we'd had some issues with neighbors in our old apartment building, so not having to deal with people was absolutely wonderful. At first, everything was perfect, kind of like a honeymoon phase. But around 6 weeks in, things started happening. It began small, practically insignificant things, easy to overlook. The back gate, which I always lock before bed, would be swinging open in the morning. Just once, then again a few days later. I assumed it was the wind the first time. By the third, I replaced the latch with a stronger one. Still, I started waking up earlier to double-check the property. Once, I even took a flashlight and walked the perimeter at 3:45 in the morning. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. I've always been a very rational person, so when I first had that creeping sense that I wasn't alone, I told myself it was perfectly natural. It was dark around me. I was in a new place, surrounded by dense forest. It was normal to feel afraid, almost instinctive to be afraid, and it was also normal for the mind to conjure up scary scenarios. I convinced myself it was all just monkeys in my brain. I turned back toward the house, but when I glanced up at the ridge behind it, I thought I saw something glinting. Ever since we'd arrived, that ridge had been particularly dark, so anything not quite as dark stood out. I stared for a few seconds, trying to make out what it could be. Maybe a reflection of something. It wasn't moving at all, so it didn't seem like an animal. Eventually, I ignored it and went back to bed. A week later, Leah found one of my shirts out in the woods. It was a flannel I hadn't seen in a while, one I thought I'd lost during the move. It was lying folded, neatly, on a tree stump about 30 yards into the woods behind the cabin. It was completely clean, as if it had just come out of the laundry, been ironed, and placed there. No dirt, no pine needles, not even a wrinkle. I hadn't been out there with it, and I definitely hadn't folded it like that. We were obviously disturbed by it. Me, because I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't done it. And Leah, because she didn't know what to believe. She asked me several times if I was sure it wasn't me. Asked if I'd ever had episodes of sleepwalking. After repeating over and over that I hadn't, she said maybe we'd dropped a box during the move and some stuff had blown out. We both knew that was ridiculous. Not only had it rained for the past 2 days, but we hadn't even passed through that part of the property during the move. Honestly, my first thought was that Leah was trying to prank me, trying to spook the city boy. She'd always said living in the Appalachians wasn't for the faint of heart, so maybe she was trying to scare me a little. But I knew her too well to believe that. Her voice, her eyes, that was real fear. She hadn't done it. Then came the trail markers. Bright orange plastic tags tied to branches. They hadn't been there when we moved in. Someone was marking a path through the woods behind our house. I followed them once, just far enough to feel unsafe, and once again, watched. I thought about saying something to Leah, that someone had been near our property, but she was still rattled from the shirt incident, nervous that someone had broken into the house, so I didn't want to scare her more until I was sure something bad was really happening. I didn't have to keep the secret for long, because after I'd been on the trail with the markers, things escalated fast. Late one night, we were woken by a single loud thud on the back porch. Not like an animal or a tree branch falling. It was clearly something deliberate. I grabbed the pistol I keep in the bedside drawer and went to check. The porch was empty, but the gate was wide open again. I stepped out with the flashlight, swept it across the yard, but the beam barely cut through the fog. I shouted into the night that whoever was out there should show themselves. That we were armed and the police had been contacted. And then, from the trees, a man emerged, completely naked. He came just close enough for me to see his face and body clearly, then smiled and told us that if we didn't leave his property, something very bad was going to happen. Then, he made a gesture that left no room for doubt. He closed his right hand, raised it to his neck, stuck out his thumb, and dragged it across his throat. I raised my gun even higher, but there was no denying I was terrified. Everything about it was off. I told him the house was ours, that we had bought it, and repeated that the police were on their way. He simply said we had been warned. Then he turned around and walked back into the trees. If it had happened now, I would have gone after him, tackled him, waited for the police to show up. But in that moment, all I could think about was how bizarre it all was. I looked back toward the house and saw Leah standing at the door. I told her to get back inside, to check every door and window while I called the police. Even though we were in a relatively isolated area, the police were surprisingly quick, or at least much faster than I was expecting. In about 18 minutes, they were there. They searched the perimeter of the house, but after over an hour, they came back saying they hadn't found anything except a set of barefoot tracks. I told them for the first time about the marked trail, and they said that if there had been anything out there before, it was gone now. Since they'd found tracks, they said they'd leave a patrol car for the night to make sure everything stayed calm, but that it was probably just a homeless person or someone high on something. I had stood face to face with that man, and I couldn't say for sure whether he was homeless or not. His gaze was focused, his movements precise and deliberate, his posture straight, his expression frozen. With the police outside, we were able to relax just a little, but all we could think about was that come morning, they'd be gone, and we had no idea what might happen after that. The man had been very clear in his threat. Around 5 a.m., I heard a noise downstairs. I got up immediately and looked out the window. I wanted to see if the patrol car was still there. Had an officer come into the house? But they didn't have a key and the doors were locked. I heard another sound and knew the man was inside with us. I threw the window open and yelled to the police that he was here. My wife, terrified, jumped up and ran to lock the bedroom door. Downstairs, I could clearly hear someone besides the police, trying to get in. Eventually, one of the windows was broken, and that's how the cops got inside. We didn't open the bedroom door until they knocked and said the house was clear. When we went down the stairs, the bottom part of the house was completely surreal. Some of the furniture had been moved around, and the entryway rug was sitting on top of the couch. 2 picture frames were shattered on the floor, and one of the kitchen knives was embedded in a photo frame on the wall. There were no open windows, no broken doors. But it was clear that man had been inside the house with us. The only explanation I can give is that he has some other way of getting inside, some hidden point of entry we don't know about. But we've searched the entire house, top to bottom, and the police did the same. We haven't found a single thing that could serve as an entry point. The worst part is, I don't think the cops fully believe us. Honestly, if the roles were reversed, I'm not sure I'd believe it either. They don't have a single piece of evidence that anyone else was actually there. Everything points to one of us. Only we know there's someone else. That we're not crazy. That we're being stalked by a man. Nothing that's happened so far makes sense. Least of all, the shirt and the marked trail. They seem like completely disconnected events from everything that followed. And why the hell would that man move our furniture around in the first place? I know he's probably just a madman, and trying to find logic in the actions of a madman is just as insane. But I need to understand what the hell is going on. We're desperate, and we're out of ideas. But we know he's going to come back, and this story is far from over. I don't even know where to start. All I know is that I have to say something, because I can feel myself starting to lose it. And I honestly have no idea what to do about what's been happening to me. I've never been the kind of person who seeks out drama. I'm not exactly a social butterfly either. I've always lived alone, always got along just fine with silence and solitude. I knew from a young age that if I ever managed to buy a house, it would have to be somewhere far away from people, but close to nature. So, when I bought this house up in the Appalachian Mountains, that's exactly why I did it. Peace and quiet. I won't lie, the price was ridiculously tempting too. But what really sold me was the isolation, the distance from cities, the idea of falling asleep to the sound of wind rustling through the trees instead of honking cars or loud neighbors. The house isn't completely isolated. There are a few others scattered around the area. But at night, when I look out the living room window, all I see is a thick, dark wall of forest. It feels like I'm in the middle of nowhere. And at first, that feeling was comforting. Now, I'm not so sure anymore. I moved here with Charlie, my dog, who's been with me for 4 years. He's a lazy old thing, the kind that spends all day curled up napping and grumbles like a cranky old man if you disturb him. He's never been skittish or reactive, never growled or barked without a damn good reason. So when, during the first few days in the house, I noticed him avoiding the back part of the yard, I thought it was odd. I tried to coax him outside, opened the door for him, even nudged him gently with my foot. But he just stood there trembling. Actually trembling. He'd end up backing away and hiding under the kitchen table. I figured maybe it was the unfamiliar forest smells, or the constant buzz of insects, maybe even some animal out there he could sense, but I couldn't. I genuinely thought it was just a phase and that he'd eventually adjust. But days went by, then weeks, and the behavior didn't change. If anything, it got worse. He became more reactive, more visibly scared. He started barking at night, always around 3 or 4 in the morning. But it wasn't normal barking. Not like when a dog hears someone near the house. It was deeper, more urgent, like he was trying to warn something off. One night, I got up and peeked out the bedroom window. The one that faces the woods. It took my eyes a while to adjust to the darkness. But eventually, I could make out a shape. It definitely wasn't a person, that much I was sure of. But I also couldn't tell what kind of animal it might have been. It wasn't moving. Yet it didn't quite look like part of the trees either. I told myself I was probably seeing things, maybe just imagining it. But then, whatever it was, it moved away. And the way it moved really unsettled me. It was far, maybe 50 meters from the house. But the shape was off just enough to make me step back from the window and feel my heart start to pound. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to calm myself down, then told myself it was probably just a deer or some other forest animal. It was dark. I hadn't seen it clearly. There had to be a logical explanation. When I looked down at Charlie, his reaction scared the hell out of me. He was shaking so badly that he'd peed on the floor. I'd never seen him do anything like that before. 2 days later, the atmosphere inside the house had become unbearable. Charlie spent the whole day hiding. And that night, I woke up to sounds coming from the roof. It wasn't just footsteps, which would have already been weird enough, but also this constant scraping. Like someone was dragging a rock or maybe metal across the shingles. I crept up to the attic and pressed my ear against the ceiling, trying to pinpoint where exactly the sound was coming from. But the moment I got up there, everything went silent. And that silence, somehow it was worse than the noise. I've never been the type to scare easily, but this was getting strange, and something inside me told me it wasn't just some random animal. That's when I decided it was time to talk to the neighbors and ask if they knew of any animal that might behave like that. The closest one to me, an older guy, didn't waste time with small talk. He came right out and said these mountains had stories that weren't worth digging into. He told me I should keep my house locked tight, windows shut, and that no matter what happened, I should never open the door at night, even if I heard someone calling me. I asked him why the hell I shouldn't answer if someone was calling for help or something. He just looked at me and said, "There are things in these woods that know how to sound like people." I'd heard stories like that before, sure, but I'd never bought into them. Never believed in any of it. Still, something about the way that man said it planted a seed of doubt in my head. My other neighbor just laughed and said it was all in my imagination. Probably some raccoon or badger with a flair for the dramatic, he joked. And honestly, that explanation made me feel a whole lot better. I went back home thinking maybe I was overreacting. But the next morning, when I went out to grab some firewood, I noticed chunks of roof tiles on the ground. I decided to get up there and see what the hell had done that. I couldn't imagine a raccoon or badger being strong enough to actually break tiles. What I found on the roof freaked me out. Several shingles were scored with deep, parallel lines, like someone or something had dragged enormous claws or a sharp tool across them. It instantly reminded me of that dragging sound I'd heard a few nights before. What kind of animal leaves claw marks like that? Maybe a bear, I thought. But bears leave very distinct marks. I knew enough to know this wasn't a bear. In some areas, the scratches were straight and evenly spaced. In others, they formed a sort of zigzag pattern, strange and unnatural. That night, I heard a whistle coming from the forest. I was in the living room watching a movie when I heard it, sharp and clear. I knew instantly it was coming from the woods. The movie was already paused, and I was sitting there, tense, when the whistle came again. This time, way closer. Charlie started whining like he was in pain. That was it for me. I got up, went to the bedroom, grabbed my gun, and opened the back door. The air outside was bitter cold, colder than I'd expected, and as I walked across the backyard toward the trees, I felt this overwhelming sense of despair settle over me. It's really hard to explain, but that's the best way I can describe it. It was a kind of hopelessness. I didn't see anything, and the whistling had stopped. So I went back inside. Now, I sleep with a rifle under my pillow and a knife in the nightstand drawer. Every night I do 2 rounds of the house to make sure every door and window is locked tight. I don't go out after 6 p.m. Even if it's still light outside, the moment it even starts to get dim, I lock myself in. I don't know what's going on, but I do know something's happening, and I'm not crazy. Something, or someone, is lurking around this house. And Charlie, who's never been afraid of anything, still hides the moment the sun goes down. He growls and barks in the middle of the night like he's trying to protect us from something I can't see. If this keeps up for another week, I'm putting this house on the market. I don't care if I have to move back to the city. Anything's better than living with this constant dread and uncertainty. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've never told this story publicly before, and for years I convinced myself there was no point in bringing it up. It happened in November of 2015 during a short stay at a historic hotel in West Virginia, and for a long time I treated it like one of those strange memories that gets filed away because it makes less sense the more you examine it. The reason I'm talking about it now is because a few weeks ago, I came across a YouTube video about that same hotel. A paranormal investigation channel had gone there after hearing stories about unexplained activity, and while they didn't capture anything dramatic, just hearing the name and seeing the building again brought the entire experience back to the surface. I realized I'd never actually stopped thinking about it. I'd just gotten very good at pretending it had been a dream. Back then, my wife and I had planned a longer vacation, but she was still finishing a renovation project at home. She works in interior design, and our house had been filled with contractors, tools, dust, and constant noise for weeks. I still had work to finish before we could leave, and instead of trying to focus in the middle of all that chaos, I booked myself 3 nights at this old mountain hotel. The idea was simple. I'd get my emails and reports done in peace. She'd join me after the renovations were wrapped up, and then we'd continue on to our actual vacation destination together. In my mind, those first few days were supposed to feel like a quiet little retreat. I'd work during the day, relax at night, and enjoy being somewhere peaceful before the real trip began. The hotel itself was beautiful in that old Appalachian way. It had dark wood walls, exposed beams, stone fireplaces, and the kind of creaking floors that made it feel like the building had been standing there for generations. It was clearly historic, but it was also comfortable and well-maintained. My room was on the 4th floor, near the end of a hallway that felt unusually quiet from the moment I arrived. I checked in during the afternoon, carried my bags upstairs, and settled into a room that overlooked the mountains. By that evening, I had finished most of my work and was finally starting to relax. I sent my last few scheduled emails, made myself some coffee, and settled into bed with my laptop to watch a movie. Sometime after midnight, I started hearing voices through the wall beside my bed. At first, I assumed it was just another guest talking too loudly. Hotels can be noisy, and older buildings don't always have the best soundproofing. But within a minute or two, it became obvious that this wasn't casual conversation. 2 men were arguing. One voice sounded sharp and aggressive, while the other sounded strained, nervous, and increasingly frightened. I couldn't make out the exact words, but I could hear the tone clearly enough to know that something was wrong. Every so often, there was a dull thud against the wall, not loud enough to sound like furniture being thrown, but deliberate enough to make me sit up and listen. I tried to ignore it at first. I remember telling myself I'd give it another minute, and if it kept escalating, I'd either knock on the door or call the front desk. The argument continued, and the frightened voice sounded more desperate. Finally, I got up, walked into the hallway, and knocked on the neighboring room's door. I knocked once, then again, then a 3rd time, and the voices stopped immediately. I waited there for several seconds, expecting someone to answer, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no apology, and no movement inside. I called through the door that I was going to speak to the front desk because I was trying to sleep, and the noise was getting out of hand. But still, there was nothing. I went downstairs expecting the receptionist to apologize and maybe send security upstairs. Instead, when I explained that there had been a loud argument in the room next to mine, she looked genuinely confused. She asked which room I was in, and when I told her, she said that the room beside mine was vacant. I assumed she meant the guests had checked out earlier, but then she added that there was actually no one staying on my floor at all. The hotel had very low occupancy that week, and the only other guests were 4 people staying in the suites on the floor above. She hesitated for a moment, then said she would go upstairs and check anyway. I followed her back to the 4th floor, feeling embarrassed and slightly irritated. I kept thinking maybe 2 staff members had used the room temporarily, or maybe there had been some kind of mix-up with housekeeping. But when she unlocked the room beside mine, it was completely empty. The bed was made, the lights were off, and there was no sign that anyone had been there recently. She apologized, suggested I might have heard noise from another part of the hotel, and went back downstairs. I returned to my room feeling unsettled, but I eventually convinced myself that the old building had strange acoustics and that I'd probably overreacted. The next night, the exact same thing happened. I finished my work earlier, watched another movie, and was just starting to relax when the voices began again through the wall. This time, there was no mistaking it. The same 2 men were arguing. One voice was angry and forceful, while the other sounded frightened and defensive. The thudding against the wall came back too, sharper now, as if someone was being shoved into it. I sat there frozen for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to call the front desk immediately. And then there was one violent crash that sounded like a body hitting the wall hard enough to shake the room. I remembered that the rooms had connected balconies, separated by a wooden divider that didn't completely block the view. My first thought was that if I stepped outside quietly, I might be able to identify the men arguing and give the front desk a clearer description. I opened my balcony door and moved carefully toward the divider. The mountain air was cold, and the hotel grounds below were almost completely dark. I leaned just far enough to look into the neighboring balcony area, and what I saw made every rational thought leave my mind at once. A man was lying on the floor, stretched out on his back. Another man was kneeling over him, with one hand pressed against his chest, and the other holding what looked unmistakably like a knife. There was blood beneath the man on the floor, dark and spreading across the wooden boards. The attacker's posture was tense and violent, as if the struggle had only just ended. I ducked back instantly, my heart slamming against my ribs, and for a second I could barely breathe. I knew with absolute certainty that I had just witnessed a murder. I ran downstairs to the front desk and told the receptionist she needed to call the police immediately. I explained that there was a man with a knife on the balcony beside my room and another man bleeding on the floor. She went pale and said that the room had been empty the previous night when she checked it. Even so, she picked up the phone and called for help while the hotel security guard came over. The 3 of us went back upstairs together, and I was shaking so badly by then that I could barely explain what I'd seen. The security guard unlocked the neighboring room and entered first. I followed close behind, expecting to see blood, broken furniture, and 2 men. Instead, the room was spotless. The bed was made, the curtains were still, and the room was completely empty. There was no blood, no knife, no sign of a struggle, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. I remember insisting that I had seen it clearly, that I wasn't drunk, medicated, or hallucinating, and that I had no history of seeing things. The receptionist and the guard searched the room carefully, but they found nothing. They both asked me several times if I was okay and whether there was anyone they could call for me. As a last resort, they even said they could have a staff member drive me to the hospital. I looked at both of them and could clearly see the expressions of sympathy and confusion on their faces. They either thought I'd lost my mind or that I was under the influence of something. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay there. I went back downstairs, too unsettled to return to my room, and sat near the lobby fireplace. An older maintenance worker was cleaning near the chimney, and after a while, he noticed how shaken I was. He asked what had happened, and I ended up telling him the whole story. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach drop. He said the hotel dated back to the early 19th century and had seen several violent incidents over the years. According to him, 5 of the 9 recorded crimes connected to the hotel had happened in that specific room, and guests had reported strange activity there for decades. I didn't know what to say. I've never been someone who automatically believes in ghosts or hauntings, and even then I kept trying to find a rational explanation. But I also knew what I had seen. I checked out that same night and drove to another hotel farther down the mountain. When I told my wife what had happened, she listened quietly and said she thought I might have witnessed something residual. 2 people trapped in the same violent moment over and over again. I dismissed the idea at first, but later, when I replayed the scene in my head, I realized something I hadn't noticed in the moment. The men's clothes hadn't looked modern. The man with the knife had been wearing dark trousers and a white shirt that looked older than contemporary business attire. And the man on the floor had been dressed in a way that didn't quite fit 2015 either. At the time, the violence of the scene had overwhelmed everything else. For years, I tried to forget about it. I never contacted the hotel again, and I never even drove anywhere near it again. But when that YouTube investigation appeared recently, I watched the entire video with my pulse racing. They walked through the same hallways, stood outside the same room, and talked about the hotel's history. They didn't capture anything unusual, at least not on camera, but I sat there feeling the same cold fear I had felt that night. I still don't know what happened. Maybe exhaustion, stress, and an old hotel played tricks on my mind. Maybe I witnessed something I can't explain. All I know is that I saw 2 men on that room, one of them bleeding and the other holding a knife. And when I went back with help, there was nothing there at all. This all happened when I was 14 years old, back when I was doing things that were obviously illegal. So, don't take this as advice. I'm an adult now, and I've had plenty of time to realize just how reckless I was. But to understand why I ended up in that situation, you need a little background. I grew up in the mountains and forests of West Virginia, and I never had the kind of family that taught me right from wrong. Nobody sat me down and explained what I should or shouldn't do. I was basically raised on my own. My parents never really wanted me. I wasn't a planned pregnancy, and my dad spent most of my childhood making my mom's life miserable. Our house was completely dysfunctional, and from a very young age, the only way I knew how to deal with everything was by leaving. I'd disappear into the mountains and spend entire days wandering through the woods. Before I was even a teenager, I'd learned how to recognize dangerous situations, avoid predators, and survive out there well enough that the mountains started feeling more like home than the place I actually lived. Whenever I had the chance, that's where I wanted to be. The town I grew up in was a little unusual for that part of Appalachia. Most of the region was struggling financially when I was a kid, but our town had a factory that had made a handful of families pretty wealthy. Because of that, I went to school with kids whose lives looked nothing like mine. Every year they'd come back from summer break talking about vacations in Florida, Europe, or places I'd only ever seen on TV. Meanwhile, I'd spent the whole summer trying not to be at home. After a while, I got tired of feeling embarrassed whenever people asked what I'd done over the break. So I started lying. I'd tell everyone I was going on vacation too. The difference was that my vacations weren't booked by my parents. I'd simply leave the house for a week or two, and nobody even seemed to notice I was gone. My parents barely paid attention to whether I was home in the first place. I'd hitch rides whenever I could, hop freight trains when I couldn't, sleep in the woods, abandoned cabins, or anywhere I could find shelter, and somehow always managed to make it back before school started. Looking back, it's a miracle nothing happened to me sooner. This story happened during one of those trips, when I was 14. I was heading toward North Carolina and had decided to hop onto a regional freight train that crossed part of the Appalachian Mountains. It was an area I'd never explored before, and I was excited to see it. My plan was simple. If I found somewhere interesting along the way, I'd get off, camp in the woods for a few days, and maybe even spend a night or two in one of the abandoned cabins scattered throughout the mountains. If nothing caught my attention, I'd stay on the train until it reached North Carolina and figure things out from there. About halfway through the trip, while I don't think we'd even crossed out of West Virginia yet, I spotted something in the distance that immediately grabbed my attention. Hidden among the trees was what looked like a massive, abandoned train station. Even from the moving train, I could tell the place had been deserted for years. The forest had almost swallowed it whole. Trees were growing right up against the old brick walls. Vines covered large sections of the building, and I could make out what looked like several rail tunnels disappearing into the mountainside behind it. I couldn't resist. Without thinking it through, I jumped off the moving train and landed terribly. One of my legs took the full impact, and the pain hit almost immediately. Even now, years later, that same leg still aches every now and then, and I'm pretty sure that jump is the reason why. Back then, though, I was 14, convinced I was indestructible, so I brushed it off, got back to my feet, and limped toward the old station as if nothing had happened. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that nobody had set foot there in a very long time. The place felt completely cut off from the rest of the world, buried deep in the mountains where nature had slowly reclaimed almost everything people had built. There wasn't a single sound besides the wind, and standing there, I had the strange feeling that I'd stumbled across somewhere people had simply forgotten. As I got closer to the station, I couldn't shake that strange feeling building in the pit of my stomach. It was this constant battle between curiosity and fear, because the place looked completely abandoned. Yet the closer I got, the more little details started telling me someone had either been there recently or was still living there. Growing up in the Appalachians, I'd heard every story imaginable about people hiding deep in the mountains. Most of them sounded ridiculous, and the few people I'd actually met over the years were nothing like the stories. They were usually homeless men who had chosen to live away from society, and a couple of them had even helped me before, after realizing I was just some kid wandering around alone. Because of that, I never automatically assumed people living in the woods were dangerous. Even so, something about that place felt completely different. Looking back now, I think my instincts recognized the danger long before my 14-year-old brain did. Every few steps I took, I noticed something else that didn't quite fit. Little details that, by themselves, meant nothing, but together created this overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't have been there at all. One of the first things that caught my attention was an old rusted Ferris wheel sitting off to the side of the property. I still have no idea how something like that ended up in the middle of the mountains, but it looked like the remains of some traveling carnival that had been swallowed by the forest decades earlier. Tied upright against one of the supports was what looked like a human skeleton, its ribs and skull covered in holes, almost as if somebody had spent hours throwing knives at it or using it for target practice. At 14 years old, I immediately convinced myself it was fake. Back in my hometown, there was this weird little occult shop that sold plastic skeletons every Halloween, and I figured somebody had dragged one out there as some kind of joke. I never walked over to inspect it because it didn't seem important at the time. Now, after everything that happened afterward, I find myself wondering whether it actually was fake, or whether my brain simply chose the explanation that made the most sense so I wouldn't panic. I kept walking toward the old station anyway, even though my entire body was starting to tense up. Every now and then, I'd hear a branch snap somewhere behind me, or leaves shifting just outside my field of vision. The strange part was that every single sound stopped the second I turned around. It didn't feel like someone was following me. It felt like someone already knew exactly where I was and was simply watching me move deeper into the property. I seriously considered turning around more than once, but the truth is that I was 14, and I barely cared what happened to me back then. My life at home had become so miserable that I honestly didn't value my own safety the way a normal kid probably would have. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but my mind just kept finding excuses to keep going. Looking back now as an adult, I think that's probably the saddest part of this entire story. A kid who grows up believing nobody cares whether he comes home eventually stops caring too. When I finally reached the station itself, it became obvious almost immediately that people were living there. There were stacks of canned food pushed against one wall, old blankets piled into makeshift sleeping areas, empty bottles scattered across the floor, rusted cooking pots sitting over long dead fire pits, and rats feeding on scraps that looked far too fresh to have been there for very long. Somebody was using that place. There wasn't any doubt about it anymore. The unsettling part was that I couldn't actually see anyone. It was almost completely silent except for the occasional drip of water echoing through the old concrete structure. That's when my eyes drifted toward one of the train tunnels leading into the mountain. The inside was pitch black, not the kind of darkness your eyes eventually adjust to, but the kind where the light simply disappears after a few feet. I stood there staring into it far longer than I should have, trying to convince myself there was nothing inside, when I suddenly noticed movement deep within the darkness. Everything happened so fast after that even now it feels like flashes instead of memories. I saw one figure emerge, then another. Two men stepped out of the tunnel so suddenly it almost looked like the mountain itself had spit them out. They were filthy beyond anything I'd ever seen before. Their clothes hung off them in torn strips. Their hair was matted with dirt. One of them seemed to drag one leg behind him as he walked, and the other carried a thick wooden club that looked like it had been carved from a tree branch. Neither of them said a single word. The second I realized they were looking directly at me, I turned to run, but I never got the chance. Something slammed into the back of my head with unbelievable force. My vision exploded white, my ears started ringing, and before I even understood what had happened, everything went black. I have absolutely no idea how long I was unconscious. It could have been an hour, it could have been an entire day. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes inside that same tunnel. My head was pounding so hard it felt like my skull had split open, and every attempt to move sent a sharp pain through my wrists and ankles. It took me several seconds to realize I had been tied up. Everything around me was still almost completely dark, and for a brief moment, I genuinely thought I was alone. Then I felt someone grabbing my shoulders and shaking me as hard as they could. A quiet voice kept whispering at me to wake up while hurriedly cutting through the ropes around my wrists. Even now, I can't tell you exactly who that person was. I think it was a young woman because the voice sounded female, but I had taken such a hard blow to the head that my thoughts were completely scrambled. Whoever it was kept glancing deeper into the tunnel every few seconds, almost like they expected someone to come back at any moment. The only thing they managed to tell me before finishing with the ropes was that the men had gone out hunting, and that if I wanted to stay alive, this was my only chance to escape. Those words snapped me awake faster than anything else could have. The second my hands came free, they untied my ankles as well. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't stop to thank them. I didn't even think about helping them. I still feel guilty admitting that, but survival completely took over. I pushed myself to my feet, ignored the blinding pain shooting through my head and legs, and sprinted toward the tiny circle of daylight at the end of the tunnel without looking back a single time. The moment I made it outside, I just kept running. I tore through the trees, stumbled across rocks, slid down muddy hillsides, scraped my arms against branches, and never once stopped to catch my breath. Every sound behind me convinced me they had already found me again. Every snapping branch made me think those two men were only a few yards away. Eventually, I reached the railroad tracks where I jumped off the freight train earlier that day, and only then did I realize everything I'd brought with me was gone. My backpack, my food, my sleeping bag, my extra clothes, every single thing I owned had been left behind. I wasn't going back for any of it. The only reason I survived out there was because I found a small spring not too far from the tracks. Lying beside it was an old dented metal can someone had thrown away years earlier. I rinsed it out as best as I could, filled it with water over and over again, and lived off nothing but that while I waited for another train. I stayed there for a day and a half, barely sleeping, constantly scanning the tree line, convinced every movement in the woods meant they had come back looking for me. By the time another freight train finally rolled through, I was exhausted, starving, dehydrated, and terrified. Luckily, that section of track forced the train to slow down enough for me to climb aboard. Compared to everything I'd just escaped, jumping onto that train was the easiest thing I'd done all week. I rode all the way into North Carolina without speaking to a single person. When I finally got off, the headache had become unbearable, so I wandered into a public restroom hoping to clean myself up. The second I reached behind my head, my hand came back covered in dried blood. That's when I realized the blow hadn't just knocked me unconscious. Whoever hit me had split the back of my scalp open. I honestly don't remember much about the following month. It's all just fragments now. I remember sleeping on sidewalks, begging strangers for food, wandering around in a daze and feeling absolutely nothing. I had no desire to go home, no desire to tell anyone what had happened, and no motivation to do much of anything. It was like my brain had simply shut itself down after whatever happened inside that tunnel. That's one of the reasons I never judge people I see living on the streets anymore. You never know what someone has survived before your paths crossed. Sometimes people aren't lazy or broken. Sometimes they're simply trying to exist after something their mind still hasn't figured out how to process. The only reason I ever made it home was because an older woman found me sleeping outside one morning. She gently woke me up, asked how old I was, and when I told her I was only 14, I watched the expression on her face completely change. She bought me the first hot meal I'd eaten in weeks, stayed with me while I finished eating, asked just enough questions to realize something terrible had happened, and then quietly paid for my train ticket back to West Virginia. I never saw her again, and I never even learned her name. To this day, I believe 2 women saved my life. One of them untied the ropes inside that tunnel and gave me the chance to escape. The other found a scared kid wandering around North Carolina with nowhere to go and made sure he got home. I'm 33 years old now, and I still live in West Virginia. I've spent countless days hiking through these mountains since then, but I've never gone anywhere near that abandoned station again. I still don't know who those men were, what they planned to do with me, or who the person was that risked everything to set me free. I don't know whether she ever escaped herself, and that's the part that still keeps me awake some nights. Everything I'm about to tell you happened when my cousin and I were kids. I was 9 years old, and he was 12, although everyone always joked that he looked younger than me because he was so small for his age. Looking back, I can't believe how close we came to something that could have destroyed both of our families forever. It's one of those memories that never really fades. You don't think about it every day, but then something reminds you of it, and suddenly you're right back there, hearing every sound, smelling the cold mountain air, and feeling that same panic all over again. I've never forgotten it, and I honestly don't think I ever will. We weren't from Appalachia ourselves, but every fall our families rented a cabin somewhere in the mountains for a week. It had become a tradition long before either of us had been born. My parents, my aunt, and uncle, and the 3 of us cousins all went together every single year. My younger cousin was only 5 at the time, so he usually stayed close to the adults, while my older cousin and I spent almost every waking hour exploring the woods, climbing over fallen trees, skipping rocks across streams, and pretending we were surviving in the wilderness. To us, those vacations felt like complete freedom. The campground where we stayed was actually pretty busy during the day. Families came and went constantly. There were hiking trails everywhere, campers cooking over fire pits, kids riding bikes between the campsites, and people sitting outside their RVs talking until late in the evening. It felt completely safe, which is probably why none of us ever imagined something like this could happen there. The campground itself was registered, well maintained, and surrounded by dense Appalachian forest. There was another campground about a mile away through the trees, so there were usually people somewhere nearby, even if you couldn't actually see them. Looking back though, there was one thing that made my mom uncomfortable almost from the beginning. There was a man camping by himself several sites away from ours. I don't remember exactly how old he was, maybe somewhere in his 40s. He wasn't loud or aggressive, and he never actually approached us. The problem was that he seemed to spend an unusual amount of time watching our campsite. More than once, my mom caught him staring while we were playing. Every single time she looked back at him, he'd immediately turn away like nothing had happened. My dad thought she was probably reading too much into it. My uncle said maybe the guy was just bored. Nobody wanted to accuse someone of anything based on a feeling. Still, I remember my mom mentioning it enough times that even as a kid, I started noticing him too. Around that time, there was a stupid challenge going around at school. Kids kept daring each other to sneak into the woods at midnight, stay out there for a few minutes, and come back with proof they'd actually done it. Looking back now, it sounds ridiculous, but when you're a kid, those kinds of dares feel like the biggest thing in the world. Nobody wanted to be the one who chickened out. My cousin had been talking about it for weeks before the trip, saying that if we were surrounded by thousands of acres of Appalachian forest, this was the perfect place to finally do it. I wasn't nearly as confident as he was, but I also didn't want him thinking I was scared. We spent the entire day pretending we weren't planning anything, then waited until everyone had gone to bed. We zipped our jackets up and slipped outside without making a sound. At the time, it felt exciting. It felt like we were getting away with something huge. Neither of us had the slightest idea that within a few minutes we'd be wishing we'd never left that cabin. The forest looked completely different at night. During the day, it had been beautiful. You could see the mountains stretching forever between the trees, hear birds everywhere, and spot little patches of sunlight breaking through the branches. Once the sun disappeared, though, everything became unfamiliar. The flashlight only lit a tiny circle in front of us, while everything beyond it stayed completely black. Every tree looked bigger. Every shadow seemed to move. Every little sound suddenly felt important. We walked farther than we probably should have, laughing quietly every now and then, whenever one of us got startled by something stupid like a squirrel or a branch snapping under our feet. Eventually, we reached a small clearing where the trees opened just enough for the moonlight to reach the ground. We stopped there for a minute because we figured we'd gone far enough to say we'd completed the challenge. That's when I noticed someone standing between the trees. At first, I honestly thought it was another camper. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there in complete silence, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. My cousin whispered that we should probably head back before whoever it was got mad at us for wandering around. I remember nodding, but before either of us even turned around, the figure suddenly started walking toward us. There was something immediately wrong about the way he moved. He wasn't calling out to us. He wasn't asking if we were okay. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. He was just closing the distance faster and faster without saying a single word. I felt every hair on my arm stand up. My cousin grabbed my sleeve and whispered that we needed to run. The second we turned around, we heard him sprinting. I've replayed those next few seconds in my head more times than I can count. We were both running as fast as we possibly could, crashing through leaves and low branches without even paying attention to where we were going. I could hear him gaining on us unbelievably fast. My cousin was smaller than me, and no matter how hard he tried, he simply couldn't keep up. I remember looking over my shoulder for one split second and seeing the man almost on top of him. Then I heard my cousin scream. Not the kind of scream kids make when they're playing. It was pure panic. When I turned back again, the man had already picked him up off the ground like he weighed nothing. My cousin was kicking, punching, and screaming at the top of his lungs while the man tried carrying him deeper into the woods. For about 2 seconds, I completely froze. I was only 9 years old. There wasn't anything I could have done physically to stop a grown man. Then instinct completely took over. I started screaming as loudly as I possibly could. I wasn't yelling words anymore. I was just making as much noise as I could. I kept screaming over and over again while running toward the campground instead of away from it. The entire forest echoed. My cousin was screaming too. Between the two of us, the noise was unbelievable. I remember hearing cabin doors opening somewhere behind us. Then flashlights started appearing between the trees. People were shouting, asking what was happening. Almost immediately after that, I heard my dad yelling my name. The man hesitated. He looked back toward the campground, then back at my cousin. By that point, more voices were coming from every direction. My uncle was running into the woods. Other campers were yelling too. Whoever that man was, he realized he wasn't going to outrun multiple adults while carrying a struggling 12-year-old. He suddenly dropped my cousin onto the ground so hard that he rolled several feet through the leaves, then disappeared into the darkness without looking back. My dad reached us only seconds later, followed by my uncle and several other campers carrying flashlights. My cousin was crying so hard he could barely breathe. I don't think I'd ever seen my dad panic like that before. He grabbed both of us and pulled us close, while everyone else spread out through the woods trying to find where the man had gone, but he had vanished completely. The police arrived surprisingly fast once someone finally managed to explain what had happened. They searched the surrounding woods until sunrise, brought in additional officers later that morning, and interviewed practically everyone staying at both campgrounds. My mom immediately told them about the man she'd been watching since the day we arrived. Once she described him, several people from the other campground said they'd noticed someone matching the exact same description hanging around their campsites too. One family even admitted they'd felt uncomfortable because he'd spent an unusually long time watching one of their children earlier that afternoon. Suddenly, my mom didn't sound paranoid anymore. Everyone realized they'd all noticed the same man independently, but nobody had acted because, by itself, staring isn't a crime. The officers took detailed statements from everyone they could find. Search teams spent hours walking the trails, checking nearby roads, and talking to people who had passed through the area that weekend. My cousin and I both described the man as best we could, but neither of us had gotten a clear enough look at his face while everything was happening. The investigation stayed open for quite a while, according to what my parents were later told, but nothing ever came from it. No arrests were made. Nobody matching the description was ever officially identified. And as far as I know, they never figured out exactly who had tried to take my cousin that night. We went home the following morning instead of finishing our vacation. None of us wanted to spend another night there. My cousin recovered physically within a few weeks, apart from bruises on his arms where the man had grabbed him. But mentally, I think both of us carried that night for a very long time. Even now, decades later, we still talk about it every once in a while. We always end up asking the exact same question that neither of us can answer. What would have happened if I hadn't started screaming? What would have happened if the adults hadn't hurt us? What would have happened if that man had managed to disappear into those mountains with my cousin before anyone realized we were gone? I don't think either of us really wants to know the answer. All I know is that somewhere in those Appalachian mountains, a man came within seconds of kidnapping a child. He almost succeeded. If I had frozen instead of screaming, or if our cabin had been a little farther from where we stopped. I honestly don't believe he'd still be here today. That thought has stayed with me far longer than the vacation itself ever did. About a year ago, something happened that still turns my stomach every time I think about it. I'm at the point where I don't know what to do anymore, because this involves someone in my own family, someone I grew up loving, someone I looked up to for most of my life. And now, every time I think about him, I can't shake the feeling that something is deeply wrong. Maybe I'm connecting dots that don't belong together, but I don't think I am. The more I think about everything that happened over the years, the more trapped I feel, like every memory I brushed aside as a kid suddenly means something completely different. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, where everybody knows everybody, and families are a little different than they are in most places. People live pretty spread out, but they're still close. A lot of the people we call family aren't actually related by blood. They're lifelong friends of your parents or grandparents, people who've been around so long, they might as well be relatives. That's how my godfather became part of our family. He wasn't my uncle by blood, but nobody ever questioned it. Around here, those lines don't really matter. My godfather was the adventurous one. He was the guy who could disappear into the mountains for days, sometimes weeks, without anybody worrying too much. My parents used to joke that if he vanished into the woods, they wouldn't even think about calling the police for at least a month because there was a decent chance he'd just wander back home carrying a backpack and acting like nothing had happened. While everyone else thought that part of his personality was stressful, I thought it was incredible. As a kid, he was my hero. I wanted to be exactly like him. Looking back now, I realize he always favored me over my older brothers. At the time, I thought I was just lucky. They were twins, always together, already old enough to have their own opinions and interests, while I was the youngest, usually by myself, always eager to impress the adults around me. Now I think that's exactly why he focused so much attention on me. I was easier to influence, easier to shape into whatever he wanted me to become. He owned a small boat, and every so often he'd take me to a tiny island hidden deep in the Appalachians. When I say nearby, I mean by local standards. It still took us nearly 2 days of hiking to reach the place where he kept the boat. The island itself was small, completely isolated, and as far as I knew, almost nobody ever went there. He used to call it his island. We'd spend several days camping there, fishing, exploring, and just enjoying being away from everyone else. Some parts of the island had caves, though, and there were areas he absolutely refused to let me enter. Whenever I asked why, he'd tell me they were dangerous and that I wasn't old enough to understand. Things started changing when I was around 12. Little by little, I noticed the way he talked about people, especially women. At first it was subtle, just small comments about how some people deserved whatever happened to them, or how certain women needed to be taught lessons. As I got older, those comments became harder to ignore. There was a bitterness in the way he spoke that made me uncomfortable, like he carried around a level of hatred that I couldn't explain. Even my godmother seemed different around him. She barely spoke, always looked nervous, and was incredibly obedient. My parents always acted like she was the odd one, telling me to keep my distance from her because she was strange. But even as a kid, I had a feeling they had it backwards. Even with all of that, he was still the only person who took me on these trips. My brothers were actually jealous of me because they never got invited. And as the youngest kid who'd spent most of his childhood wishing he could be included in everything they did together, finally being the one everyone envied felt amazing. It made it very easy to ignore the little things that didn't seem right. The years passed, and we kept visiting the island together. By the time I turned 16, he told me I was finally old enough for him to show me something he'd never shown another person. He kept saying I was the only one he trusted with this secret, that nobody else knew about it, and that if everything went well, I'd be part of something special. Looking back now, it sounds exactly like manipulation. Back then, it sounded like the greatest compliment I'd ever received. I couldn't wait to find out what he had been hiding all those years. We planned to spend 3 days on the island. We each had our own tent, and the trip started like every other one we'd taken together. We fished, cooked over the fire, and explored the shoreline. He told me that on the 3rd day, he'd decide whether I was worthy of seeing what he'd kept hidden from everyone else. I remember feeling excited every time he mentioned it, constantly wondering what could possibly be so important that he'd waited years to tell me. What actually changed everything happened on the very first night. We had both gone to sleep in our own tents when I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't even sure what had pulled me out of my sleep, but after sitting there for a few seconds, I heard it again. It was incredibly far away, barely loud enough to make out, but it sounded like a scream. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a woman yelling somewhere across the island. I climbed out of my tent almost immediately, and my godfather came out just seconds later. He asked whether I'd heard something. I told him I was almost certain I'd heard a woman screaming, and that maybe someone out there needed help. The look on his face changed so fast, it caught me completely off guard. I'd never seen that expression before. It wasn't fear, it wasn't concern. It was disappointment, mixed with something colder that I still can't put into words. He looked directly at me and, in the harshest tone I'd ever heard from him, told me that some people didn't deserve help, especially women. I just stood there staring at him. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know how to process what I'd just heard. The hatred behind those words didn't sound like someone making an offhand comment. It sounded personal. It sounded like something he truly believed. Without saying another word, I went back into my tent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept replaying his face, the way his entire expression had changed, and the way he'd said those words without the slightest hesitation. It felt like I was suddenly standing next to a completely different person than the one I'd admired my entire childhood. The next morning, I told him I wasn't feeling well and wanted to leave. He didn't argue. He looked at me for a few seconds, almost like he already knew why I wanted to go. My godfather had always been incredibly good at reading people, and I could tell he understood that something had shifted between us. He simply told me he was disappointed in me and that I'd proven I wasn't worthy of seeing what he'd planned to show me. We packed our things, left the island, and barely spoke during the entire trip back. To this day, I still wonder if I walked away while someone out there needed help. My relationship with my godfather never recovered after that trip. We hardly speak anymore, but I know he still goes back to that island every now and then. What was supposed to be one of the best memories of my life ended up becoming one of the darkest. And after everything I've remembered over the years, I can't stop wondering whether I came much closer to something horrifying than I ever realized. Then, last year, something happened that completely sent a chill down my spine. A journalist reached out to me confidentially and asked if I'd be willing to meet with him. He told me he was investigating a human trafficking network, mostly involving women, and that my godfather's name had come up multiple times during the investigation. Apparently, someone had given him my contact information because I was considered the person who knew him best. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop, and I spent the entire time feeling like I was betraying him. Even after everything that had happened over the years, part of me still saw him as the man I looked up to when I was a kid. But by that point, I couldn't keep ignoring all the warning signs anymore. I told the journalist everything I knew, every memory that had stayed with me, every detail that had never quite made sense. As far as I know, the investigation is still ongoing. I have a feeling it's only a matter of time before someone contacts me again.